spelled wrong. Shakespeare. Yeah. Hello. How is everybody? Everybody okay? I think the name Shakespeare is spelt wrongly in the introduction part here. It should be Shakespeare and race with a P-E-A-R-E. And I know Shakespeare would like to spell his name in lots of different ways, but there we are. I'd like us to think about why we're here and to sort of welcome you to this sort of analysis and discussion on Shakespeare and race and why we are talking about William Shakespeare and what it means to us in terms of our understanding of ethnicity, race, diversity, and English history all at the same time. So the important thing for us to begin with is that Shakespeare is often regarded as the most important writer of the English language. In other words, the person who is the most famous writer, English writer, to have ever existed. And it is often claimed that he originated a lot of the words that we use in the English language. and a lot of the phrases that we use in common vernacular, common speech, these are words and phrases that he also originated. Now, for some of us, an understanding of Shakespeare seems quite remote to us, quite strange. The language of Shakespeare seems very archaic, very outdated, very outmoded. Often we can't relate to it because it seems not like the words that we use. And if we have a cultural origin that comes from the continent of Africa directly, or from the Caribbean or elsewhere, with our patois or our languages, indigenous African languages, and then our English, sometimes the early modern English is too much of a stretch for our minds, or we think it is. So we often may feel remote, or that language may seem strange to us, but it's not. To understand Shakespeare, all we have to do is understand the rhythm of it, and the rhythm is based on a basic principle of the English language, or any language for that matter, which is the Iambic Pentameter, which is the 5 beats per line. Di-dum, 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 di-dum. These 5 beats per line are the basis upon which Shakespeare writes his poetry. This is also the basis upon which most music and songs are written and transcribed, with the same 5 beats per line. Di-dum, 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 di-dum. So poetry is also based on these same 5 beats. This is in relation to what the beats do to your heart. So the sound of the words create the feeling, and the feeling is there to get you into a certain kind of emotion. And so when we start talking about some of the Shakespearean language, I don't want you to feel alienated by it. I just want you to say the words to yourself. Listen to the sounds that the words make and relate those sounds to yourself. Okay, good. Let's get on. So I'm going to share the screen now with the presentation. Good. And you should see a screen now saying narrative I. I want to give you a few phrases that that have an origination or a root that goes beyond their Eurocentric moorings. So this is one of the phrases. It's a very famous English phrase, or people will tell you that it's a very famous English phrase, which is "I'll find a way or make one." Sometimes it's transcribed as "I'll find a way or make a way." Yeah. Now, this is often attributed to one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Robert Sidney, 1588, an artist who was one of Shakespeare's contemporaries. He's often spoken about as being the originator of this term. However, the term probably comes from Hannibal, speaking or writing in Latin, or at least somebody transcribing what he is saying in Latin, which is, "I will either find a way or make one." He was talking about his conquest of Rome. So here I'm saying to you that this is a very English phrase, and yet the origin of it may come from an African source. So William Shakespeare is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, English writer of all time. But we know very little about William Shakespeare. Much of what we do know is sort of wrapped up in legend and mystery. We have his writing, or we think we have his writing, which is a scribbly hand, not like the man of a literate, competent writer who wrote so many plays and so many stories. And yet we are convinced, many people are convinced, that this man that lived in Stratford upon Avon, who we call William Shakespeare, was the author of all these plays and stories. Over 38 plays, which is a huge amount, and hundreds of sonnets and other poems. Generally regarded as the greatest writer of all time, described by his contemporary Ben Jonson as the soul of his age. Created new words in the English language, created new phrases now used in the English language. These words, these phrases are stock phrases. For example, if I say to you to be, many of you will say or not to be, taking it from the play Hamlet. Or if I say to you, now is the, many of you will finish off the sentence or that line in the stanza with, now is the winter of our discontent. If I say what's in a name, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, you'd know that these are the words of Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. Just to say to you that these are phrases that have come to become part and parcel of the English language. Or if I said to you, if music be the food of love, if music be the food of love, again, Shakespeare coined this phrase. Or the better part of valor is discretion. To thine own self be true. To thine own self be true. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, I come to bury season, not to praise him. Nothing will come of, nothing will come of nothing. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war, A horse, my kingdom for a horse, and the world's my oyster, which I with sword will open. The smallest worm will turn. Frailty, thy name is woman. Yeah, that's the phrase. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. And the last phrase, O brave new world. O brave new world. Okay, good. And all that glisters is not gold. Now let's take this phrase. So let's digress a little, okay, away from Shakespeare so that we can understand it. This is a picture of Elvis Presley. Now, Elvis Presley is usually attributed as being the founder of rock and roll, the king of rock and roll, the discoverer of rock and roll. And there was a sort of idea that somehow he created it from his wholly omnipotent individual imagination, and that rock and roll comes about entirely as a result of from his imagination. Yeah. However, anybody who studied music knows that the woman, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the African-American woman, the genius, had created music that was already sounding like rock and roll many, many years before the so-called king played Blue Suede Shoes or whatever, or Shake, Rattle and Roll. So Sister Rosetta Tharpe is now generally regarded as one of the pioneers of rock and roll, not Elvis Presley. Or the music writer who you may not know, the African-American music writer Jesse Stone, who helped to write a lot of the songs that characterized rock and roll music. Again, he's often forgotten, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Or Big Joe Turner, who actually wrote Shake, Rattle and Roll. Again, he's someone who never got the fame that Elvis Presley did. I mean, he had a certain degree of fame in his life, but never got the fame that Elvis Presley did. But the point is that we don't remember him as the king of rock and roll. When we think of rock and roll, we don't think of Big Joe Turner. We think of Elvis Presley. Little Richard, of course, had a huge impact in rock and roll music and in the development of rock and roll music. And yet, he's not remembered as the king of rock and roll. And Chuck Berry is often counted as being the originator. And yet, he also is not the king. Can we see in that concept something important? First of all, Elvis Presley popularizes and makes commercially viable rock and roll music. He interprets it to a mainstream wide audience. He translates what would otherwise be a black thing into a thing that the majority population who are listening, who are predominantly white, can understand and absorb. He moves what would be radical chic into the establishment, and therefore he absorbs it. He is or he was should I say, a member of the establishment, or he became one at least, and was involved in covert operations connected to the state apparatus. Right. Now, all I have done is just change the name at the top. And let us see that William Shakespeare is very, very similar. He popularized and made commercially viable ideas and stories present within his time, some of which originated from outside of England, outside of Europe, and from other places throughout the world. He interpreted and translated those stories and ideas for a wider population so that they could be absorbed. He moved ideas that were once radical chic into the establishment, and he was involved in covert operations connected to the state apparatus. So that by understanding more recent history, we might understand more earlier history. The study of history is cyclical, and characters appear in history that have a lot of similarities. So Shakespeare is one of a number of Renaissance writers like Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, and Francis Bacon. Some of these people are claimed to be the real William Shakespeare, or that the work that William Shakespeare produced is an amalgamation of their ideas and concepts. Robert Greene in 1591 says that for is an upstart quo, beautified, upstart suggests that he's a Johnny-come-lately, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is well able to bombast out a blank verse. Don't get lost in this language, please. Keep with me. All you've got to do is understand the rhythm of it as the best of you. And being an absolute Jonas Factorum is sort of Latin, is bastardized Latin, for Johnny come lately, Jona Factorum, Johnny come lately. In his own conceit, the only shake scene in the country. So he's making a joke. He's making a joke of Shakespeare's name by putting the peer, P-E-A-R, peer, as seen. So he's saying that essentially Shakespeare isn't all that. He's a Johnny-come-lately. He's someone who's taken the ideas of others and put them together, popularized them for himself. So this crow or magpie is someone that takes the prizes left by others, repackages them. Crows and magpies look for shiny things, and then when they find these shiny things, they entwine them into their nests and they claim them as their own. And that is what Greene is saying that Shakespeare did. So let's explore one phrase, and we might see how those things which we may think of as being so early modern English, in fact, have their origins to places outside of England, even outside of Europe. So this phrase that he uses, all that glisters is not gold, is from the Merchant of Venice. Now, there is a 1280 phrase, written over 300 years earlier. And it says, do not hold everything as gold which shines like gold. And it's a Latin phrase. But this phrase goes back even earlier to Chaucer. And Chaucer writing in his Old English, or should I say Middle English, says, "Hi, it is not all gold that glareth." In the center, it is not all gold that glareth. In other words, he's saying simply because it looks like gold doesn't mean that it is, just because it shines like it. And John Ludgate in 1430 said, "All is not gold that outward showeth bright." Edmund Spenser says the same thing, and Shakespeare is continuing the same thing. So can we see that with this phrase, Shakespeare has merely taken a phrase that goes back hundreds of years and he has popularized it? Good. So Shakespeare also, or the works of Shakespeare popularized much older stories. Some stories that come from ancient Greece or Athens, Roman stories, and even stories that come from Africa, from the continent of Africa. Now, there is a famous writer of anecdotes and stories called Aesop, who lived more than 2,000 years ago. Yeah, and he wrote a story about the hen and the golden egg. This is Greek. This is ancient Greek. Yeah, this is the ancient Greek language. Obviously, many of you can't read Greek. So this is the English translation. A cottager and his wife had a hen that laid a golden egg every day. They supposed that the hen must contain a great lump of gold in its inside. In order to get the gold, they killed it. The foolish pair, thus hoping to become rich all at once, deprived themselves of the gain of which they were assured day by day, because there wasn't actually any gold inside the hen. So the phrase was that came from that, beware, all that is gold shines not. That's the phrase. Now, Aesop also had another story called the miser. And the miser sold all that he had and bought a lump of gold, which he buried in a hole in the ground by the side of an old wall, and went to look at it daily. One of his workmen observed his frequent visits to the spot and decided to watch his movements. He soon discovered the secret of the hidden treasure, and digging down, came to the lump of gold and stole it. The miser on his next visit found the hole empty and began to tear his hair and make loud lamentations, began to cry. A neighbor, seeing him overcome with grief and learning the cause, said, "Pray do not grieve so, but go and take a stone and place it in the hole, and fancy that the gold is still lying there." In other words, you are not deprived of anything since you did not enjoy it. And it goes on, bury not gold to inherit more. So by burying gold, you don't inherit more. Now, these African origins of Proverbs are really important. And it's really important that these Proverbs are coming from somebody called Aesop. Now, let's remember the story of Aesop again, Aesop's stories again. He buries gold under a tree. Yeah. Now, and he says that this gold glisters not. Now, in a play written by Shakespeare called Titus Andronicus, there is a character called Aaron. Aaron is described as a Moor. The term Moor in early modern English society described, in this case, a person of African descent, actually of a dark complexion. Yeah. Now, the character Aaron in Titus Andronicus says, this character buries a pot of gold, yeah, and says, "He that had wit would think that I had none, to bury so much gold under a tree, and never after to inherit it. Let him that thinks of me so abjectly know that this gold must coin a stratagem, which cunningly effective will beget a very excellent piece of villainy. And so repose sweet gold for their unrest, and then he hides the gold." Now, why is Shakespeare getting Aaron to bury gold under a tree in a similar way to the miser in Aesop's fable? It is because Aaron has a connection, being an African, to the story of Aesop. So Shakespeare is making a joke. He knows that the origin of this phrase comes from an African origin. And he also knows that the story relates to this African character. So it is entirely fitting and feasible that the African character does this very African thing. Okay, here we have another point. We talked about this phrase, "all that glisters is not gold." Now, this phrase is uttered in the play Merchant of Venice by the Prince of Morocco, an African character, yes, described as a Moor, as a tawny Moor, tawny meaning brown skinned Moor, whose blackness is actually also described in the same play. This is a dramatic conceit to express the origin of these phrases. His audience may be aware of that origin and that he is not the originator, just like Elvis Presley is not the originator of rock and roll. Okay, so this question about Aesop, you might still have a question, but surely Aesop is a Greek writer. When you look up Aesop after this lecture, you may say, well, Onyeka said that he was, African, but I found out that he's Greek. Well, actually, you could be both. It's actually possible to be both. But the point is, within the conceit of the early modern world, he was associated with being an African and was described as, in even the 1st and 3rd century CE, as a snub-nosed, swarthy, dwarfish, bandy-legged, short-armed, short-armed, squint-eyed, and liver-lipped. These are, of course, derogatory terminologies to describe somebody of African complexion. Swarthy means black. Obviously, there are variations of blackness, but the other terms together tend to describe somebody who was of African descent or with strong African ancestry. And we have other descriptions of him within the 13th century who described Maximus Planudes, described Aesop's complexion as black, from which the dark tincture, as in color, he contracted his name. Aesop's being from the name Ethiops. Ethiops describing people with burnt skin. That's where the term comes from, Ethiopian. It's a Greek term, a derogatory term to describe the complexion of people of African descent. And when Maximus Planudes was asked to describe the origin of Aesop even further, he said that Aesop claimed that he was a Negro. This is a drawing, 1687. The character on the left is a characterization, a caricature of Aesop, clearly showing a man of African descent and clearly distinct from the other two characters here. Here in the position of service, pretending service, a man that serves himself. Again, illustrating the conceit that Aesop is an African. So this is really important because what am I saying here? I'm saying that William Shakespeare is respected and lauded, and the phrases and the terminology that he's used is often described as being revolutionary for the way that the English language developed. Moreover, people say that he was a genius without looking at the origin of that genius and the fact that some of that genius can come from African sources, and that Shakespeare merely popularized ideas present in many other cultures and languages and made them translatable and absorbable within the early modern society that he was part of. Not that he originated them quite in the way in which we think. Okay, let's take this idea a little further. In the same Merchant of Venice, there is a character called the Prince of Morocco. Who was the Prince of Morocco that's described here? Certainly there were real people who came to England during the 16th century who were ambassadors. One of them was Ahmed al-Mansur, a butcher and a brutal man who invaded the Empire of Songhai in 1591 and killed a lot of people. But the point was that he originated from Morocco, from what is now Morocco. And also there is this man here, Abid Quadad Ben Masoud, who in 1600, as you can see in this painting, came to England. He was the ambassador from Morocco. These individuals may well be some part of the inspiration for the Prince of Morocco in that story. And why is Morocco described? Because Shakespeare, in a way, is showing us the connections that existed between England and parts of Africa, including Morocco. In the latter part of the 16th century, England was a rogue state, and it was at war against Spain, yes, and Portugal. And Spain was the most powerful nation in Europe. And Portugal was under pressure from the Habsburgs who were ruling there. Some people who ruled in Spain, such as this person here, Charles V, were the most powerful people in Europe. So in 1578, at the Battle of Alcázar al-Kabir, Morocco defeated the Portuguese, and Sebastian I of Portugal was killed. Mullah Muhammad adds al-Mansur to his name after that victory. This is the same Mansur. This is the reason. So this victory against Portugal and the friction that existed between these North African states and Spain and Portugal are the reason why England in the 16th century was connected to these Moroccan states for the sake of trade, relations, and diplomacy. Elizabeth I traded arms with the Moroccans and salt pepper and saltpeter that was banned from trade within Europe was also part of the deal. The Morocco or Barbary Company was established in 1585, and these negotiations were secret. These activities defied a papal ban on trafficking with Muslims. And secretly, individuals such as Abid Ben Quadhed Ben Masoud arrived in England to negotiate arms deals, effectively what they were, trade and arms deals. So these individuals were visitors to early modern England, and they stayed in early modern England. Early modern England had people like this within its shores. There were other people from Morocco, such as this described as an African lady and gentleman from Belgium, 1584, who are the Moors that are often described in early modern Renaissance literature. So some of these connections were because there was even an idea that these Islamic North African states would form an alliance with Protestant England against Catholic Europe, and that the Muslim North African states had more in common strategically with their Protestant European friendly competitors than they did have with the competition that came from Spain and Portugal. So the idea was that perhaps Morocco and England would divide the empire of Philip II in half, each taking a portion. Now, there was even an idea that Elizabeth I should marry Al-Mansur or the Ottoman Sultan to secure an Anglo alliance against Spain and Portugal. What a world we would have had, perhaps, if that marriage had ever occurred. So this is a really important thing that I've just said, that in many ways, these North African states were more connected strategically and politically to Protestant England than they were to Catholic Spain. And yet we might think of the idea of European supremacy or white supremacy as being an historic thing that goes back as far as the history of Europe goes back. But it doesn't. White supremacy and European supremacy in that form is a relatively recent thing. That doesn't mean that there wasn't ethnic chauvinism present in English society and other parts of Europe, but the idea that everybody, simply because they were white, was part of the same unified ideological concept was an alien thing in 16th century Europe. So Elizabeth I didn't just have occasional African visitors. There were Africans inside the English court as permanent members. One was a favorite little blackamoor who in 1572, she had a special suit made. There was a garson coat of white taffeta, cut and lined and stripped with gold and painted with prints and ribbons. There was even an idea, a very scandalous idea, that Elizabeth I had had sexual relations with this young man or with other Africans. 1584 scandal letter. So the answer to that accusation about this connection Elizabeth has with Africans and these sort of relationships is again to be found in William Shakespeare. In The Merchant of Venice, the same play, The Merchant of Venice, Portia, sort of out-Heroding Herod, says, "A gentle riddance to draw the curtains go, let all of his complexion choose me so." She's talking about the same Prince of Morocco, and she's saying that his complexion makes her unworthy as a mate, as a marriage partner for her. This, of course, is propaganda. It's propaganda. The audience will get the joke. The early modern audience will get the joke because they know about the scandals and the stories. regarding Elizabeth I and her connections to Africans, albeit the princes of Morocco or ambassadors to Morocco, or her favorite little blackamoors, or the other Africans that went to her court. They know the scandal and they know that this was present. But us, with some sort of amnesia, 20th century, 21st century amnesia, forgetting that Africans were present in early modern society, may well conclude that Portia's statements have no relationship to the history of early modern English society, but they do. So this question of Shakespeare and England is very important because art imitates life. But like all art, it's a heightened reality. Just like the films that we have from Hollywood don't portray reality in perfect exactness. So Shakespeare's writings don't tell us everything. They're not factual documentaries. They are stories. But they help us to understand lots of things about early modern society. However, his plays are full of lots of extreme things, plot twists and excitement, sexual innuendo, violent innuendo, references to nudity, and all these sorts of things. Now, most people's lives are not full of all of that type of stuff, but the plays are to keep you watching and to keep you interested. And in the same way, the African characters in Shakespeare's plays are heightened reality. But nevertheless, they show an indication of the ordinary lives of people of African descent living in Tudor England. So these lives are not as exciting as Othello in Othello. They're not as impactful as the Prince of Morocco in the Merchant of Venice. They're not as exciting as the activities of Aaron in Titus Andronicus. They are far more ordinary. Let's have a look at this quotation written by George Best, a contemporary of William Shakespeare. And he says, "I myself have seen in England a fair white English woman in a relation with an African man beget a son in all respects as black as the father was, with the African expunging the good white blood of their spouse." Now, George Best is talking about in England, there are people of African descent who are marrying white English women. And then the children that are produced, he says, have the complexion of the father. He's not just saying that this has happened once. He's saying he's seen this happen a lot. This is almost 500 years ago. And yet they will tell you that Africans only just came on the Empire Windrush in 1948. Okay, it's not just George Best. In 1596, the 1st of July, there is a letter addressed to the Aldermen and Mayors of London, and it says, "An open letter to the Lord Mayor of London and the Aldermen, his brothers, brethren, and there are of late," this is what the letter says, "divers blackamoor," divers meaning many, blackamoors brought into the realm, this is the Old English spelling of realm with an E on the end, "of which kind of persons there are already here too many." Please note the Old English spelling. So this letter is saying that there are Africans brought into England, but there are already people of that kind who are here who are too many. Of course, it sounds like Enoch Powell 1968 or a modern racist ideology speaking now. But this is over almost 500 years ago. A second letter says something similar. "He only desires to have license to take up so many blackamoors here in this realm and to transport them into Spain and Portugal." And it said they should be served by the people here should be Christians and served by their own people, not those kinds of persons. There is a proclamation of 1601 says, "Whereas the Queen Majesty, tendering the good and welfare of her own natural subjects, is greatly distressed in these hard times of dearth, is highly discontented to understand the great numbers of Negroes and blackamoors, which, as she is informed, are fostered and powered here, to the great annoyance of our own liege people, that which covet the relief which these people consume, as also for that most of them are infidels, non-Christians, having no understanding of Christ's words, gospels." So these are three documents that talk about an African presence, and talk about an African presence as if those Africans are not rare oddities, but even that their presence offers some form of systematic threat to the nature of English society. In fact, these documents aren't quite what they appear to be. They are not documents that resulted in African people being discriminated against in this country. They are not documents that resulted in Africans being deported. And they are not documents that caused a deterioration in the status of Africans. But nevertheless, they do tell us that people of African descent were a significant presence inside early modern English society more than 500 years ago. So we have more information here. This is from a parish record, and is the record of Simon Valencia, a blackamoor, a term used to describe an African. They are making sure that you remember that they're an African by not just describing them as a Moor, but as a blackamoor, in case you were in doubt. Buried 20th of August, this is his burial record, 1593. This Simon Valencia was a servant to Stephen Driffield, a needlemaker, and he was buried there on the 20th of August, 1593. There is another record to an Anne Vassy or an Anne Vase, a blackamoor wife to Anthony Vassy, trumpeter of the said country, buried 24th of April, 1618, more than 400 years ago. This Anthony Vass and Anthony Vass, so it is Anne Vass and Anthony Vass, are probably both Africans. That's why it says of the said country. That's an early modern way of saying that they are of the same ethnicity. Okay, this is from Bristol, just to show you it's not all London, but all over the country that this population existed. We have Sir John Young did appoint a blackamoor to keep possession of his garden in 1560. This blackamoor garden was employed in the house backing onto the Bristol quayside. And this is from St. Philip and St. Jacob's Parish, Bristol, from the 13th of September, 1603. Joanne Pointing, the wife of Thomas Pointing, being a blackamoor, now buried on the 13th day of the plague, September, same year. Now, Joanne Pointing is in fact the blackamoor, married to Thomas Pointing, showing that marriages occurred between African people and white English people. In this case, a woman of African descent, Joanne Pointing, who married a white Englishman, Thomas Pointing, and she was buried on September the 13th. This is a record for Maria Moriana in Southampton from the 15th and the 16th century. She was a servant to an Italian from what is now Italy, Genoa, called Filippicini. She went to court because this Cini, just to illustrate that these people are not slaves, this Filippicini attempted to treat Mariana as a slave by not paying her, etc. When the matter went to court in 1470, more than 500 years ago, they said that she cannot be treated as a slave, and that Filippicini's attempts were a base plot to have her sold. And simply because she cannot speak nor understand, that's the old early modern English way of saying speak, nor understand English nor Latin. That's why she was treated in that way, and that this was a base plot to have her sold, and that she cannot be treated in that way. Moreover, that she must be given meat and drink, and that she cannot be denied meat and drink, and it was against the customs of the time to treat her in the abject way in which she was being treated. This is to help illustrate that people of African descent were not automatically enslaved. This is another record from Salisbury for Elizabeth Blackmore that lives at White Hart. She was buried there on the 26th of January in 1653. To tell you that these records are to be found all over the country. This is a record from London. Sabrina, a blackamoor wench. Wench described a young woman buried on the 30th of January 1589. or Domingo here, a blackamoor buried on the 8th of January, 1587. The same sim in Valencia that we've just described. This is a young man Negro, a term used to describe Africans, name not known and not a parishioner, who died in the street, but no man at the time did know him, at the liberty of East Smithfield, and he was no parishioner in 1587. Or Christian Ethiopia. Ethiopia, clearly a representation of her Africanness, baptized on the 18th of March 1602 in Stepney, London, and was described as a daughter of a Blackmore. Records also include Elizabeth, who was the daughter of an African called George, married in Mary Smith All Saints Church, Staplehurst, Kent. And this George was a blackamoor, as described in this 19th of May 1622 record. We have the image here of John Blank on the Westminster Tournament Roll of 1511, and here a record for payments to John Blank from earlier in that time. If you read it carefully, you can see item to John Blank, the Black Trumpeter. We have here another record to Deirdre Joanqua, St Mildred's Poultry Parish Register. John Joanqua, the king's son in Guinea, to show you that there were royalty, noble people of African descent. This is of West African descent. Guinea is a way of describing West Africa. Baptized on the 1st of January 1610 or 11. He was 20 years old and the son of Kadiba, king of the river of Cestus in the country of Guinea in West Africa. Guinea is again a colloquial term describing a West African country. And this Deirdre Joanqua was present, baptized in England more than 400 years ago. Or Walter Ananaberry, the son of Nossa Ananaberry, born in the kingdom of Dangwala, also in West Africa, on the 3rd day of February in 1610, All Hallows, Tottenham, Haringey, London. Okay, so these are images of Africans from Europe in Shakespeare's time. These images of Africans playing chess in Spain and Portugal. This is an image from Lisbon in Portugal. Again, showing people of African descent as part and parcel of Lisbon society, part and parcel of European society. This wonderful painting showing an African woman and a white European woman together in this Renaissance setting of Renaissance Europe. Here is a wonderful etched drawing showing Regiment Indiana, one of the 6 artists here, a famous artist of the 17th century. And one of the most famous artists of his time, but strangely forgotten by us. Yes? So Shakespeare dumbs down all the blackness that we've just been talking about. He translates it. He absorbs it, just like Elvis Presley did with rock and roll. And to understand African presence in England, in Europe, sometimes we have to look beyond Shakespeare. Renaissance art gives us an idea. For example, these are images of Balthazar, the Black Magi, in the Adoration of the Magi in 1520. Balthazar is the individual on the right. Look how spankily dressed he is in white taffeta and red silk. Okay, notice also that Balthazar is the individual here on the left, dressed here in white, might be silk or linen. Again, he is almost a foot taller than the other Magi's or kings, and he's also arriving later. This is a close-up of the image. And his daughter is behind him. He's not alone. He is with his daughter here. This is Balthazar in the center ground in the Adoration of the Magi, 1540s. Also, this is from Italy. Again, showing that this is a conceit, that we see these African Magi's as young men and as central to this story. In some cases, more central than the baby Jesus. Again, the light seems to be shining on the young African Magi here, again depicted 1480 to 1490 from France. Across Europe, we see this same tradition. And here, an equally dashing African Magi from the Adoration of the Magi in Netherlands, 1520. And here, I'm from Sweden in 1475, an unshaven African Magi. The reason why he's unshaven, we will talk about that in the next session, not this one. But I just want you to remember that he is unshaven. So these images are to be found across early modern Europe. They are prominent in early modern Europe. We see Africans portrayed again and again around early modern Europe, and yet we forget their existence. We forget, and the only story that we know about African history is slavery. And we just, in fact, we don't even know that story properly. But that's the story that we have. It's a nominative story. It's the normative story. It's what we consider to be normal. And that's our reference point to always talk about slavery. And this does a disservice to African history and does a disservice to the African contribution to European history. This is a photograph of the statue of St. Maurice that is next to the grave of Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Let us note, please, that this statue shows an unequivocally African knight, because St. Maurice was often described as an African, St. Maurice being a euphemism for Moorish, Mauritius, again a reference to blackness from the word Moor, M-A-U-R-O-S, the Latin word for black. But not only is St. Maurice as a statue standing over the Holy Roman Emperor of Europe, who was the most powerful man in Europe, but the actual place where the statue is located and where the tomb is located is the Medbourne Cathedral, or the Cathedral of St. Catherine and Maurice. So the cathedral is named after St. Maurice and St. Catherine. Not just the fact that there is a St. Maurice in there, but the cathedral is named after this African Moorish knight. So he was a legendary leader of the Theban Legion in the 3rd century and tortured and killed. And he is again depicted in images and paintings throughout the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century. And this is the Theban Legion. We're going to focus on these images later on next week. We're going to talk about more of these images. So he wasn't the only one. There were also legendary figures that formed an intrinsic part of European hegemony and European culture, but we've also now forgotten, or we would also whitewash into whitewashed images. But in the early modern society in which Shakespeare wrote his plays, these people were described as unequivocally African. The Queen of Sheba was one of those who is described as an African and black in early modern literature, and painted like this, even if she does have flowing blonde hair. So we've been through quite a lot. Yes, we've been through quite a lot, and we have talked about a great deal. Now, some of these ideas and concepts and principles we will be talking about next week. We will continue some of these things. We'll be going into a detail about what St. Maurice meant to early modern English people, what the Queen of Sheba meant to early modern English people, what some of these ideas on blackness meant to early modern society, and why it is and how it is that we seem to have an amnesia about it. So we started by talking about Shakespeare and the importance of Shakespeare for the development of the English language. Then we went on how the language of Shakespeare was framed, and that he wasn't in some cases the originator, but merely the translator, the interpreter. That he made fashionable ideas and principles, words, sayings, idioms, phrases that come from other writers, including sometimes from writers who were born outside of this country, from Greek stories and fables, and even occasionally from people of African descent, either in Europe or elsewhere. And then we went on to say how he put the words of these, often he put the words that he used, that he made popular, into the mouths of characters who were of African descent. And that these characters actually are not just fantasies, how some academics will claim to you, but related to people of African descent who were living in early modern England and Europe throughout the 14th, 15th, 16th, and early 17th century, and how Shakespeare made popular, but of course sexed up the notions of blackness and Africanness that were present in early modern society, and also, to a certain extent, obscured this presence. And what we have to do to understand his presence is cut through some of that obscuring to see these people. But can we? Can we? Have we got the objective capacity to view the history of the country in which we are part of with any degree of objectivity? Or are we so caught up in 21st century modernity that we are unable to understand the history of this country, and all we can absorb is the political polemical perspective that is told about this country? So the fault might not be in Shakespeare, but the fault may be in us, not in our stars, but in us and in our capacity, because only with objectivity can we actually begin to understand the history of this country, the history of this country that we are in fact a continuation of. Good. So I've stopped speaking now, and if you have questions, can you post the questions and we can talk. Okay, so we have a question here, or we have several comments. I'm living in the, I think it's a comment more, isn't it? I'm living in a matrix world. Any hopefully right interpretation. Well, that begins with you, Jill. Jill asked a question about the kind of world that we're living in terms of it's an unreal world in which Shakespeare's storytelling, history, narrative, and language is obscured behind a veil of white Englishness that has no space for any kind of African interpretation. I think that's what you're saying. But you have the capacity to have other interpretations, and so that isn't going to come necessarily from anybody else but you. There are few people who have access to even the information that you have received today. And so therefore the responsibility, I'm afraid, Jill, is actually on you. So I never learned this at school. Teachers can only teach. So Serena asked the question, why didn't I learn this at school? Well, the answer is that teachers can only teach what they know. If they don't know it, they can't teach it. So most teachers in this country are grown up with a politicized, polemical perspective on English history that in fact they inherit from the Victorian 19th century colonialism and imperialism. It's a white supremacist perspective of English history that's not the history of England or the history of Britain. It's a history of white people in England and Britain. It's a history without color. In fact, it's a history of white men. In fact, it's a history of upper class white men in England and Britain. It's not even a history of women. It's not even a history of the majority of the population. So this is the history that we have of this country. Now, other interpretations of this history are there, but you've got to find them. You've got to work hard to get them. Yeah, we all have a responsibility, Jill. Jill asked the question, whose responsibility is it to teach history? It's everybody. We all have a responsibility because we're all living. Mohammed asked the question, thank you for this hour. Queen of Sheba is known as one of the legendary queens. Yemen had a sort of debate that she didn't rule Yemen. Yeah, of course. She's a legendary figure. I'm not saying that she can be proved to be who the early modern English people said that she was. What I said is that in early modern English society, they regarded her as a black woman. Yeah. Okay, good. Christy Lane says, I'm a secondary school teacher. What's an obvious first step? I'm an English teacher. Well, the first step is to start with what you know and then continue from what you know to where you need to go to. So there is a long list of books that will help you decolonize the curriculum. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about decolonizing the curriculum. So there's a long line of books that will help you decolonize history curriculums, English curriculums, language curriculums, and help you understand this in some more detail. I think we're out of questions. So if the moderator wants to step back in. Oh, we've got another question. All right, fascinating. Despite doing a module called Revisiting Shakespeare a few years ago, I had no idea about this, like Aesop being a black ancient Greek in Shakespeare using this material. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, you probably wouldn't know about it because most teachers don't know about these connections to other ethnicities because it's not something that's taught. Because what's taught is a 19th century, 18th century Victorian concept of Shakespeare, which is devoid of color to support the notions of imperialism and colonialism within the then British society, not as a transliteral translation of the actual early modern English society that Shakespeare lived in. Yeah, I don't want to read a reading list sent out. Probably one can be made available to the organizers, the fantastic organizers of this event. The readings can be passed on to them, and they can perhaps pass it on to you, pass it on to yourself. If there aren't any more questions, we could perhaps the moderator could step in at this point. If they're there. Thank you. So just thank you everybody for joining us. We will be continuing this next week and examining more information next week and the weeks after. So we look forward to continuing this process. So if there aren't any more questions, I presume that the moderators will come in and end this round of our discussion. Thank you.